the last episode of Quest for Freedom, Professor Harbans Mukhia, the prominent historian from JNU, talked about the transition of medieval history to colonial history in India. He discussed the historical situation of agriculture, economy, cottage industries in the medieval period, particularly the Mughal period and afterwards. Today he is going to talk to us about the transition when East India Company took over and how did it impact agriculture, cottage industry, culture and society, Indian society. We shall learn all this, Professor Mukhia.
Hello friends, back for the second lecture in the series. In my last lecture I mentioned in conclusion that at the height of its power and glory, the Mughal Empire was the richest empire in the world, and India was in control of something like a quarter of the world's wealth, 25% of GDP. So it was a country where an empire which dazzled the European travelers. Many of them came from Europe. They were all dazzled by the wealth and opulence of India. That was early in the 18th century. By the beginning of, not really beginning, but as the 18th century advanced, it began to fall apart. This was something that the mighty Mughal Empire hadn't envisaged. How did it begin to fall apart? The emperors and the empire thought in grand terms of, great empire, and which it was, of course. But it did not accommodate, it did not envisage the regional aspirations within the empire and within the country, within the empire really. That India, or for that matter Mughal Empire, is vast, of course, but it is vast because it consists of many regions, and each region has its own identity. Every country has its own diversity, of course. Even small countries and big countries they always had and have. But there is no other country with such diverse regional identities, cultural identities, linguistic identities, religious identities as India has been throughout its history. Very largely because of the manifold migrations and invasions. All countries have been invaded around the world, and migrations have taken place in all countries around the world throughout history. So India is not an exception, but India is to some extent unique in the sense that it has faced the widest range of migrations and invasions. So the immense variety of the diversity of people who came and settled down, and people and cultures and languages and so on, who settled down here in different regions, that gives a unique character to India in medieval, or for that matter modern or present. So that Mughal Empire hadn't taken into account these regional identities, regional aspirations. And by the 18th century, towards the end of the 17th century and 18th century, these regional aspirations began to assert themselves. The Marathas in the west, the Jats in the Agra Mathura region, the Sikhs in the Punjab, Awadh, Bengal, Hyderabad, Deccan, and so on. So all of these regions began to assert their identities and therefore, and of course, a lot of bloodshed took place, battles took place, and the empire began to fall apart in the 18th century. Now, it's interesting that until very recently, the 18th century was largely sort of painted as by almost everyone as a century, a dark century of darkness. There was no bright spot in this century. The imperialist historians, British colonial historians, they painted the 18th century as a dark century because they tried to show that it's the British colonial occupation of India that brought light into this darkness. The nationalist historians of India, like Tara Chand, primarily among them, K.K. Datta, and so on, many of them, very great historians, they painted this century as a period of, in Professor Tara Chand's words, moral cancer. What was the moral cancer? That great emperors like Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan, they had given way to, Tapni Hapni, very weaklings as rulers who spent all their time pursuing pleasures of the flesh and so on and so forth. Somehow, sexual pleasure was seen as a sign of moral cancer in Tara Chand's words. This was a Victorian kind of view of sexuality. And the Marxist historians, they also saw it as a period of decline when the great empire had declined and colonialism had taken over. So it was usually seen as a period of great decline by everybody. But recently, 18th century has become a very a century of very great interest by historians, because this is a century when lots of things are happening almost in every sector of society and polity and economy. Lots of things, lots of changes are taking place, radical changes are taking place. So therefore, it has aroused very great interest lately. Earlier it used to be quite sort of neglected, more or less. Now it's a very hot century, as it were, for the historian. So it's a century. So I'll deal with this century very briefly. I'm not going into the whole of the modern period, which this century is supposed to inaugurate. I'll deal with some of the changes which occurred in this period and which survived, which were enduring changes. Some of these still survive with us. So I'll deal with in a very broad way, given the time that we have, broad manner. I'll deal with some of the very fundamental changes which took place in the 18th century after the decline of the Mughal Empire. Now, apart from the regional powers or regional forces that I mentioned, Marathas and Jats, etc., a new entrant into the scene was not 18th century, earlier than that, were the European companies. The European companies European travelers had started coming into India in the 17th century. 17th century is full of European travelers from every part of Europe, and 18th century, of course. But travelers were followed by, many of these names you must have heard, Bernier and Tavernier and Manucci and so on and so forth. They left behind very detailed accounts of their travels in Mughal India, which excited the Europeans greatly. And in the foot of after the travelers came the East India companies. Various East India companies were founded, uh, which who were trading with India, who were tempted to buy Indian textiles, particularly textiles, indigo, spices, and so on and so forth, and sell them at very, very high profits in their own home countries. So the profit from Indian goods was extremely high, so tempting as to take all the risks and so on and so forth, and huge amount of travel. Uh, so that the profits were so high that they took all the risk and came and picked up Indian goods and sold them. And in exchange for these Indian goods, they paid in bullion, in gold and silver. Uh, Now, these East India companies, various East India companies, they actually fought wars with each other to occupy a space in the Indian trade market, manufacture and trade market. They were the English, of course, East India Company, we survived all of them. French company, Dutch, Portuguese, Danish, all of these companies, they established what they call factories in India. Factories, actually, the name factory is misleading. It's not factories, it's storehouses, but they came to be known as factories in India. So they came to have factories, their own sort of, locations, factories where they could store their goods and transport them to their own mother countries. Uh, now, as these factories got established, they began to defend these factories against raids, and therefore they began to recruit their own small armies, which began to expand with their own expanding resources. There is a delightful book called The Theft of India. Let me say, The Theft of India by Rox Moxham. Uh, he shows how before, after the after uh, Vasco da Gama's landing here, uh, up to the Battle of Plassey, between 1498 and 1765. Uh, uh, he shows how these companies, various companies, were plundering India. He calls it the theft of India. How they were ruthlessly, cruelly burning villages if they if they denied them trade or defied their diktat and so on. And yet they used all their resources, armies and so on, to plunder India. So they were stealing India from Indians through the use of force. So they began to collect force, increasing amount of force, to first to defend their factories and then to plunder the areas and so on and so forth. So that they were gradually expanding their resources, both economic resources as well as their military resources. They were expanding, which they were going to put to very great use later on. Now, of all these companies which fought with each other, East India Company survived and defeated and survived all the rest, and they became, as we know, the masters of India gradually. All of these companies began to interfere with the Indian rulers and internecine warfare by becoming mercenaries. They would help anyone with their guns and artillery and so on, whoever paid them. So they were mercenaries. So they gradually began to so-called help them, but actually began to gradually dictate to them, interfere with their own internal affairs and so on and so forth, and becoming sources of authority themselves. Gradually, the East India Company, as I said, outpaced all of them. Now, in all these regions, Bengal was a prized apple, as it were. It was known for its riches, for its textiles, particularly for its riches, generally for its riches. Bengal was a prized apple. And it's there that the fate of India was decided. In 1757, when the Battle of Plassey took place between English East India Company and the Nawab of Bengal, Sirajuddaulah. The reason was that Nawab Sirajuddaulah had started quoting the French, in preference to the British, and had started giving them rights and privileges which the British had been granted. So the British were fearing the loss of privileges like dastak. Dastak is a permit to trade with certain concessions and so on. And there was also private aid, lot of private aid, illegal private aid, and in which the highest of them, including Clive, was engaged. So there was a lot of interests involved, companies' interests as well as private interests were involved in all of this. So that when Sirajuddaulah started quoting the French in preference to the British, there was naturally tension, and it led ultimately to the Battle of Plassey, in which Sirajuddaulah lost the battle for various reasons. One big reason was that Clive had bought over to his side the commander-in-chief of Sirajuddaulah, Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar is a kind of a stereotype of a traitor who betrayed his master. He was the commander-in-chief, but when the battle was taking place, he just kept quiet. So let his master be defeated. The battle was lost, but Mir Jafar was not the only one who was a traitor. Clive was assisted by almost all big bankers. In fact, the battle means it involves money. The money part of it came, for the financial part of the battle came from the Indian bankers. Some of the most important bankers, Jagat Seth. Jagat Seth was initially one person, but it came to be a firm, Jagat Seth firm, the biggest bankers in that time. Jagat Seth, Mehtab Rai, Sarup Chand, Raja Janki Ram, Raja Rai Durlabh, Raja Ram Narayan, and Raja Manik Chand. These are all bankers and money lenders and so on. They were the ones who financed Clive's battle, and in which our Sirajuddaulah lost, and Mir Jafar then became the Nawab. Mir Jafar, great demands were made on his finances. He couldn't meet the demand. Great demands were made on his finances by the East India Company, who were now victorious. They couldn't meet the demand. He couldn't meet the demand, so he was replaced. Mir Qasim was brought in. Mir Qasim was again replaced, and it went on and on like this. And in 1764, another battle took place at Buxar, which proved to be crucial in the transition of India to a colonial economy, of course, but colonial state also, into the colonial period. That was the the first was the Battle of Plassey. This is the Battle of Buxar. And as a result of the Battle of Buxar, which again they lost, Mir Qasim lost, and then the Emperor Shah Alam, he had to transfer the Diwani rights to the East India Company. That's to say, the collection of revenue, rights to collect revenue from Bengal, and Bengal doesn't mean the present day Bengal. Bengal was a very extensive area, including Bihar, Orissa, and so on. Collecting revenue, while the administration was responsibility for the administration rested with Mir Qasim. The money part, the financial part, the revenue went to the East India Company. So East India Company got free hand to plunder the resources, while the administration floundered because of the lack of money. So this is that period. This is when uh, colonial colonial rule begins really in India. It it didn't change everything immediately in 1765. The change always occurs over a period of time, but this is the beginning of that change which began to occur. And there are any number of books on this transition which was taking place. Uh, uh, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay has a beautiful book called From Plassey to Partition. Recently, William Dalrymple has written a marvelous, very detailed account of this plunder that was taking place by the East India Company, and ruthless, absolutely ruthless, merciless kind of plunder by the East India Company called the Anarchy. So there are lots of books on this, quite a large, huge amount of study of this period. So this is the beginning of that colonial period that we are now talking about. Now, the colonial period changed everything fundamentally. In the earlier discussion that we had, I had mentioned that lots of things happened at the top level in the medieval period, Mughal period particularly, but the economic structure, the social structure didn't change fundamentally. It grew certainly, but did not change fundamentally. And one of the it grew in riches, in resources, and all of these growing resources were reinvested naturally in back in India. Uh, so, uh, so that expansion of resources took place, expansion of agriculture took place, canals were dug, expansion of crafts production took place, and so on and so forth, which made the whole of the country much richer than earlier. Now, what happened with the East India Company was that the revenue that was collected, like the Mughals, they also collected land revenue primarily, others also, but land revenue primarily. They collected this revenue. They did not invest in the infrastructure, in the expansion of agriculture, for example, or craft production, for example. They use this to buy Indian goods which were being produced, for which earlier they used to bring gold and silver. Now they were buying those goods with the money that they were collecting as revenue from the land, from the Indian farmers. That is the money that they are. And with this goods that they were collecting, they were buying with this money, these goods were transported back to their own mother country, in this case England, or Europe as a whole, but England primarily, and sold there for more profit. So they were making no investment of their own in this profit. They were earning profit from this, huge profit as earlier, but without making any investment, which they used to do earlier with bringing in gold and silver. Now they were using Indian farmers' revenue or income for buying these goods and selling them in their own, so that they made a fundamental change in the economic structure of the country, where the money from India, the resources from India, were not more than money. The resources from India were used for buying goods to be exported to Europe, and expanding their own profits. Now, just one example of this is this ruthlessness of this transactions is that they also expanded into China, where they tried to sell opium to the people of China, make them started administering opium to the people, so they get used to eating opium. And when the Chinese resisted opium, uh, getting treated with opium or getting used to opium, when they resisted, they waged two wars with China, forcing them to buy opium from the East India Company, and these are called opium wars. They forced China to buy opium from the East India Company, which opium the East India Company, English East India Company, has purchased from the revenue that they had collected from the Indian farmers. So you can see the whole scenario of it. How what shall we say? Apart from being cruel, how ruthless the profit motive can be, that you can turn a whole people of such a big country like China into opium addicts just to earn profit. And this opium addiction you create by money which you have extracted from the farmers of another country. This is the kind of transformation that the East India Company was beginning to do. And secondly, that they were beginning to control the process of production in India. If they needed wheat, they would ask them to, well, they didn't need wheat. Textiles, for example, they would ask them to produce textiles of a certain kind. When the fashions or demands in Europe changed, they would ask them to change their designs here and adapt to the new fashion. So they must produce according to our design, our will, rather than their own will. So that and gradually or for example, if you traded in opium, then they forced farmers to produce opium rather than wheat or rice or whatever. So that the farmers were being crushed as well as the craftsmen were being crushed all the time. We have heard stories of how the Dhaka muslin producers, they were producing muslin which is so fine that you can insert a whole many yards of muslin into a ring that you wear on your finger and pass it through a big ring. So that this fine muslin was a very famous product, which they ultimately decided to force the craftsmen to produce muslin, but at prices they had fixed, not what the craftsmen had fixed, but what they had fixed, which were substandard prices, subsistence prices. And therefore the craftsmen started cutting off their thumbs in order not to be forced to produce these muslin and so on. So we have heard these stories. So that they were controlling production in the agriculture field, they were beginning to control production in the crafts and so on. So that there was an overall kind of exploitation of resources of India to be transferred to Britain. Not these resources had been collected earlier also, all states collect resources, but they were being invested within the country for the improvement, betterment of the country, of the people of the country. Now these resources are being transferred to Britain. So Britain is a metropolitan country, mother country. India is a colony which is to be exploited for the benefit of Britain. And it is through these resources, drain of wealth, as Dada Bhai Nauroji called it, this transfer of these resources, that England became a rich, powerful empire which controlled half the world, more than half the world, gradually. So that it is India which had financed England's growth as an industrial country, as an imperial country, as a powerful metropolitan empire. So that the whole basic structure of India was changed with the coming of Corona. Let me, and at the end of in 1947, when Britain left India, India's control of GDP, world GDP, was reduced to 2% from 25%. Such was the poverty inflicted on India by colony. Let me just take up one point before I leave. You know, we are told often that, you know, yes, all this is true, but then Britain also gave so much to India. You know, it brought India into the modern world. One, through the teaching of English, which is an international language, so India became a part of the modern world. Two, by all these structures, bureaucracy and judiciary and universities, these are all structures given to us by the British parliamentary democracy. We have learnt it from Britain. So all these structures also came from Britain. So Britain also gave to India, not only took India. Okay. But you know, the assumption here is that the only way India could have transited into the modern world, 20th, 19th or 20th or 21st century world, was through this through this channel of colonialism. There was no other way in which India could have transited to the modern world, which is a false assumption. We have so many other countries. China also transited to the modern world without picking up English as its as its language of instruction in there. Japan also did that. Russia also did that. They have also become big modern powers in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, particularly 20th and 21st century, without going through the experience of, well, China was colonized by many countries, not by one, Chinese territories, but they didn't pick up any of the either the language, English language, or the institutions that we keep talking of. You know, they have developed, each one has developed its own institutions, its own mode of transiting into the modern world. So it's not as if England had not colonized India, India would have been still left behind in the 18th century scenario, would still be speaking Persian or reading Persian and speaking Urdu, and would be still be without any kind of modern facility or modern institution or any sign of modernity. That obviously is not true. Each region, each country has its own mode of coming to terms with the demands of the society in which they live, demands of the times in which they live and in which they grow, and each society finds its own way. India also would have found its own way, even if it hadn't learned the English language. Thank you very much.
It has been a great experience listening to Professor Mukhia about one of the darkest periods of Indian history. Well, he has explained to us how, through deceit, cleverness and bribe, East India Company and its Commander-in-Chief, Clive, defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla, how Mir Jafar, the chief army commander of Siraj-ud-Dawla, betrayed him, how the Indian traders, the bankers, connived with the East India Company to defeat its own ruler. And later on, when East India Company took control, how the agriculture perished. Not only that, how the cottage industry declined in this country, how the taxations were heavy and the income coming out of taxes was utilized in propagating business interests. They would purchase Indian goods, sell abroad with huge profit, not only in Europe but in China. They will force or coerce the farmers to grow opium, sell opium to China. This not only destroyed Indian economy, Indian agriculture, they destroyed economy of China as well. So that was a very dark period. We have also learned how the income, the GDP of the country, which was about a quarter or 25% of world economy, world GDP, declined to only 2%. So that was the British rule in India. I think it is a great experience, great knowledge that Professor Mukhia has given to us, a great insight into our history. I hope this will help us fight prejudice and see fresh. That's the important message of history. So kind of you, Professor Mukhia. Thank you very much.